He didn't think about the commodification of knowledge. And that is what's happening today, along with the commodification of labor, and we might say now nature, because nature now includes land, it includes water, it includes the very air we breathe. So the commodity creates the ecological crisis that we face. Money, Polanyi didn't conceive of the different ways in which money would be commodified to develop the financial crisis we face, but he did not consider the very idea of the commodification of the production of knowledge. And that is what is happening around the world, including the social sciences. And that has enormous implications for how we do social science. And so what I want to talk about then is, what is this commodification of the production of knowledge? What does it mean for our university systems? And I think it affects universities in most parts of the world, with some notable, interesting exceptions. And how can we, in a sense, think about an alternative vision of the production of knowledge in the context in which we are now living? So, a model that we have operated with, and I say we, I think deliberately, I think the vision of the university around the world is one of an autonomous organization, the idea of a self-regulating community pursuing knowledge together, collectively, and also, in a sense, competitively. But the idea of the autonomous university is one, I think, shared globally. That model has gone. That model has gone. We are living in an era where the university's relationship to society is now porous. There is the membrane that separates university from society is becoming thinner and thinner. We have to recognize that. Now, in Brazil you have a different history, because you remember a time, well, even in the dictatorship, even in the military dictatorship, the universities had a certain autonomy, at least in Brazil. Not true in Chile, not true in fascist Germany. But anyway, the vision of the autonomous university, I think, has gone. I think we were living in a fool's paradise to think that it would continue. We have to rethink the meaning of a university now, knowing that the university is, in a sense, part of society in a way that it was not. Still observer, but very much participant observer in society. So what to do? So what do we have instead of the autonomous university? Well, we have the market model of the university. And along with the market model, which I'll describe in a minute, we have the regulation model of the university. And I think you are not exempt in Brazil from pressures of this character. And the question is this: is there an alternative model? And that's what I want to come to in the end. Yeah. Okay. Let me tell you about that. Is your hand up? No. I'm used to talking to students on the front row. Okay. So, the market model. Well, the market model, I think the market model, California is I come from the University of California. It's a great place for the market model. It's amazing how this was supposed to be, the showcase of the public university in the world. And, in the last 5 years, well, in fact, the last 20 years, but in the last 5 years, it has become increasingly the model of privatization, rapid privatization. So what has happened in California? Well, decline in state funding. Very simple. Very simple. And so that means we have layoffs of academic staff, non-academic staff, reduction of salaries. Well, salaries of faculty at the University of California, fell for 2 years, and then they knew that the prestige of the university would diminish if the salaries fall, so they bumped them up again. But at what cost? Well, at what cost? Basically, the money from the state is being made up by student fees. The imagination was like this country, no student fees. That was the imagination in the 1960s. But now the student fees go like this. I could give you figures, but it's exponential increase. So we are now paying, students are now paying $10,000 a year for education. And it is the regents who control the University of California are saying it will be $20,000 in 3 years' time, $20,000 a year. And then they say it's a bargain. Dirt cheap, a bargain. Why? Because it costs $40,000 at Harvard and Yale and Princeton. So the student fees are basically making up for the decline in state funding. So where else does money come from in this privatized world? Commercialization, we get corporate donors, corporations start giving us money. If we're lucky because we have research scientists that in principle can offer something to, in the biomedical field, for example, can offer things to industry, science-industry collaborations, and the university looks ever more like a corporation involved in getting money. Yeah, such is education. So what else? Well, what happens is the degradation of education. We have increased numbers of temporary faculty. So the tenure system is not removed, but fewer and fewer people have tenure, and we have instead increased numbers of temporary faculty, super exploited. Then we have talk about distance learning, which is happening in many places. And disciplines are being threatened, particularly interdisciplines like African American studies, ethnic studies, gender studies, and, who knows? Sociology may be next. Who knows? At this point, we feel secure because we teach lots of students. That means we bring in lots of money. Yeah. Okay. And what happens with all this is that there is a hierarchization within the university between faculty in different schools, between faculty in different disciplines, between faculty in the same discipline, salaries polarized, and between universities too. So there is an increased polarization and differentiation. Solving a problem defined by a client. We are the consultants of the world. We are servants of the state. We are paid for the knowledge that we deliver. Expertise. That is the idea of policy. Okay, and of course, in most parts of the world, that's how social scientists survive. They can't survive on their salary. The rest of Latin America, they have to have 3-4 jobs, right? And they are consultantships. They do survey research or something, opinion polls. This is how actually sociologists actually survive. In Russia, well, let's not talk about Russia. That's a very sad and tragic story in my view. Okay, because there the policy was very strong under the communist regime and continued to be very strong in the post-communist world, in the post-Soviet world. Basically, sociologists just set up small cooperatives to deliver opinion poll research to politicians, to corporations. And it led to a very fragmented and undeveloped professional sociology. Professional sociology is sociologists talking to themselves, one another. This professional sociology is the building up of what I call research programs. You have some wonderful research programs here in Brazil, and I, as a labor sociologist, am particularly interested in the labor research program that has an amazing history going back to the 1950s. And as the world changes, so the puzzles change, and so the research program expands. But this is research in which the researchers talk to one another, publish articles in journals read by one another. That is professional sociology. But then there is critical sociology. That is the engagement of sociologists, social scientists in the critique of the professionals for the assumptions, theoretical, methodological, philosophical assumptions of the research programs. The critical sociologist is always, what shall I say, is the person who is always irritating the professional sociologist, asking the professional sociologist to examine, interrogate the assumptions that they take for granted, questioning the values that underpin their research programs. And there's a long tradition of critical sociology again in this country. And finally, we have public sociology, social science. And here, the critical sociologist involves a community of critical thinkers, but they are talking to fellow academics. In the public sociology, we have sociologists talking to publics. That is, to communities, associations, movements outside the academy. That is the idea of having a conversation between the social scientist and a lay community about the direction, values, and goals of society. That is the vision of the public sociology. Those are my 4 types of knowledge that all disciplines, and I include the natural sciences, all disciplines have. All 4. So, what does this mean? I would argue that all disciplines have these 4 types. I would also argue that we have to see any discipline as involving the interdependence of all 4. A flourishing discipline involves all 4. And when any one of these becomes autonomous, separated from the rest, there is a problem for the discipline. When professional sociology becomes self-referential, when critical sociology becomes dogmatic, when policy sociology becomes the servant of the client, and when public sociology seeks a populist base, trying to be as popular as possible to sell as many copies of your books. So, the argument is that there is an interdependent relation among them, but there is also a relationship of domination. That in reality, in different countries, in different disciplines, in different historical periods, these are articulated in a relationship of domination. And increasingly, we are facing a world in which the professional and policy are dominating the critical and public. And I think that is a potential global tendency. And certainly in the United States, well, I remember when your ex-president, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, I know he's not a very popular man among sociologists, but I remember when he came to Berkeley in 1980, and he saw all these sociologists, handing their papers to one another, very critical, very radical, and he laughed. Of course, you can be very radical if it has no significance at all. Where I come from, if you hand out a radical paper, that can get you into jail. Yes, well, that was, of course, 1980. But anyway, yes, in the United States, professional sociology is very well developed. And the public is less well developed, and the critical is probably less well developed. The policy, well, you see, sociologists are not very popular in the state, so they don't have a lot of policy sociology. There is some, and that varies over time. Anyway, I can draw pictures for different countries at different periods in time, and it's lots of fun to think about how countries differ in this regard. So, yes. So, what is important is that these are 4 types of knowledge. So an individual can actually be in 2 or more. Look, take Juarez. I heard a wonderful celebration of Juarez 2 nights ago. Lopes, yes. How do I pronounce it wrong? Oh, that's too. I'll say Juarez Lopes. No? Brandão. Juarez Brandão. Ótimo. Okay. Well, anyway, let me just say, it's a fascinating story. But my laser beam, unfortunately, doesn't really work. All right. Basically, It's fascinating. Juarez begins where? In the University of Chicago, 1951, professional sociology, and a quite conservative professional sociology at that. Comes to Brazil, starts doing field research outside Sao Paulo, field research in working class communities, actually becomes a sort of policy sociologist, advises management how better to rationalize the work process. So he's dabbling between the professional and the policy. Then comes 1960s and the early 70s. And what happens to Juarez? He joins with FHC, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, in the discussion in Sebrae, creating Sebrae and talking about what? Capital. Marx. The guy becomes radicalized. He becomes a critical sociologist. And of course we know that Sebrae also, and this is the fascination of Brazil, was very much the institution of a public sociology engaged in relations with the wider society. And so Juarez, in a sense, moves in from the critical into the public. There's a whole shift. You can see how individuals have their own careers through these four types, and how these four types are rooted in historical processes. Okay. Now, anyway, I won't do it, but you can also talk about teaching as having four types too. But I will move on because I haven't got a lot of time. Now, the question is, so what? What is this to do? What is this to do with the vision of alternative models of the university? Well, if we put things in any national context, these four types of knowledge take place in institutions, in the university or sometimes outside the university. We have to see the relationship between the university and the wider society, locate them, and therefore we have to see the relationship between the policy and the extra academic world, public and the extra academic world, critical, well, we'll see how that, and the professional. Let me just show you very briefly how these interfaces, how these connections work their way out. Oops. You see, policy sociology has two spheres, you might say. You have the idea of what I call a sponsored policy research, in which the client tells you exactly what they want. But also in the university, you have people who advocate policy sociology or policy issues or solve policy problems. They have a more autonomous relationship. There is an inner and an outer sphere, you might say. Equally, you can talk about an inner and an outer sphere, for professional sociology. The inner sphere is, in fact, the rules that regulate our community. But increasingly, rules are coming from outside to regulate our community. The regulatory model, the ways in which the state becomes increasingly intertwined with the university. And the question is, to what extent can the university retain autonomy? And in many parts of the world, the state is directly organizing the production of knowledge. And of course, in dictatorships, that is essentially what the university does. It is an instrument of the ruling dictatorship. But today we have different forms of regulation, more bureaucratic forms, that many places in the world partake in. So many governments are obsessed about the ranking of their universities in a world-class scheme. And what does that mean? Many countries want to imitate the universities that are supposedly best. And supposedly best means those in the United States and those in Europe. China is a fascinating case. They invented the most widely known ranking system, the Shanghai system, precisely to rank their own universities in relationship to northern universities. So this ranking system is indeed spreading everywhere. So that is the formal imposing themselves on the substantive. Yes, we can also talk about the interface between the critical disciplinary knowledge and the interdisciplinary infusions. I think many of the most inspiring and interesting ways that critical knowledge develops is through communication with other disciplines, interdisciplinary thought. And finally, most importantly for me, is the distinction between a traditional and an organic public sociology. You see, public sociology, public anthropology is concerned with generating debate and discussion in the wider community, wider society. And you can do this in two ways. One is you can write in your newspapers, you can do interviews on the radio and television, you can write books that are widely read, and there's a long history of that in Brazil. But there's also another type of public sociology, public social science. It's not a mediated but an unmediated relationship between the scientist and the community. It is the public sociologist who engages directly with communities, with neighborhood associations, with trade unions, with religious organizations, that involves an unmediated dialogue with publics that are narrower, thicker, more active, and often oppositional. So there's two types, the organic and the traditional, coexist. And of course they have coexisted in this country. There is always a tension. The organic public sociologist is always being pushed towards delivering and being a policy sociologist for the community. It's a very risky and difficult position to hold, to sustain a dialogue between the scientist and the community. The traditional public sociologist, I mean, you might say, to go beyond the Brazilian borders, Pierre Bourdieu was the sort of great example of a traditional public sociologist who would in fact command attention in the public sphere by virtue of his pronouncements, backed up by sociological knowledge and expertise and understanding. Sometimes. So, I mean, there is this idea, therefore, the traditionalism has have a more autonomous place. But anyway, I think, therefore, you need both. You need both the organic, sort of on the barriers, on the frontiers, engaging with communities, and you need the traditional that gives an broader overview, generating debate. The point is this, and I'm sorry my laser beam doesn't work, but my point is this, that to sustain a discipline embedded in society, there has to be a continuing relationship between the substantive advocacy traditional discipline. The inner zones must be connected to sustain, to prevent the capturing of the discipline by external forces. And what we see in the world, in my view, is increasingly the formal dominating the substantive, that's the regulatory model, and the sponsor dominating the advocacy, that's the market model. So, this gives me the chance to talk about alternative models. As you can imagine, they involve looking down below. Let me then, no, forget about that. We can talk about it. Let me just now give you there's the regulatory model. That is the formal rationality dominating the substantive rationality. And there are elements of that here, and of course I'm using Britain as an example. Then there is the market model. Here we have the idea of market forces, of basically selling knowledge, producing knowledge for consumption by clients who pay you money. Corporate donors are the best because they are the richest. States pay money. This is the market model. The market model. I think there is an alternative model we call critical engagement model. And that is a model in which we in the community, academic community, engage with one another, discuss with one another what we are doing. I think we do not do enough of that. I think the disciplinization of the social sciences and the academic world, in a sense, makes us ever more autonomous from one another. We have to transcend those boundaries, not necessarily to build interdisciplinary knowledge, but to publicly, in our public, the university, to discuss what we are about as academics in a world where the university is increasingly part of and subject to forces in society. We need to create the university as a public sphere.